Hello, ladies and gentlemen. I am Harry Lauseniziris, and this is my YouTube channel, grecochess. And today I have something different for you. I'm going to share with you and present the longest game I've ever played. And when I say the longest, I mean in number of moves. This happened very recently. It was an online game, and let's go now to the details. I'm going to share with you my screen from chess.com. And this was part of a national match between the national teams of Greece versus Bosnia-Herzegovina. I was representing the national team of Greece. My opponent was representing their home country, Bosnia-Herzegovina. And how does this work? This was part, by the way, of the European League EL of the year 2025, the sixth round. How does it work? Every team filed 53 players. The way it actually goes is every team files as many players as possible, and out of the two numbers, the smallest one is that prevails. So this meant that each team ended up having 53 players, and the top-rated player of each team, in this case, Gibat from Greece versus Miki Zavidovici from Bosnia-Herzegovina, were facing each other, and then the second best-rated players, the third, the fourth, and if you want to see where I am, I'm not going to show you because I'm going to spoil the surprise, but I'm at place number 40, 40, out of 53 players, almost near the bottom, only above 13 players. Currently, the score is 28.5 points for Greece versus 24.5 points for Bosnia-Herzegovina. The first team that reaches 53.5 is the winner. In each pair, they play twice. Once each player has white and then the other player. When I was playing my opponent, when I had the black pieces, I ended up with a draw. Nothing spectacular, threefold repetition. In this game, really, there is nothing special other than the fact that it took so many moves and the surprising ending. But we'll go now to the game to see what actually transposed. I had the white pieces, as I mentioned. Ratings, you see that they're almost the same. I'm barely ahead. 1359 versus 1350. That doesn't mean anything. And I start with my e-pawn, as I usually do. Why? Because the e-pawn, if you push it, it opens diagonals both for the bishop and for the queen. If you push the d-pawn, it opens only for one of the bishops. That is not really an important advantage, let me tell you. Even at the highest level, there are many other moves to start. You start with the d-pawn. You can play the English opening with the c-pawn, or even the g-pawn to g3 to have the fianchetto, or even the knight goes to f3. And Magnus Carlsen, the world's strongest player, may do any other crazy kind of openings to show you that even with an inferior opening, he can beat you. My opponent plays with the most popular reply to e4. It is a Sicilian defense. Pawn goes to c5. I continue. My knight goes to f3. Opponent's pawn goes to a6. My pawn goes to d4. Until now, it is opening theory book as a computer, as they say. My opponent deviates from the book, but plays the best possible move. Pawn takes to d4. I take back. My opponent pushes the pawn to e6 to open, of course, the diagonal for the dark-colored bishop. And I return to the book, knight to c3. What does it mean, return to the book? It means that this position has been analyzed, belongs to the metaphorical opening book, but has been reached with different order of moves. My opponent attacks my knight at d4. I have to do something. If I just allow the exchange, my queen at d4 will be attacked by the knight on c6. That's why my bishop goes to e3 to protect twice. My opponent sends the queen at b6, and they're attacking my knight twice, but they also attack my pawn on b2. And this currently is not a poison pawn because I cannot just put my rook on b1, because then I'm also going to lose my rook, my knight at c3. And no, my knight cannot go to a4 to protect because queen goes to b4 and checks. So I need to do something, and what do? Knight goes to a4, attack the queen. If my opponent thinks that they're attacking my knight on d4 twice and it's defended twice, they're in for a big surprise. Once they take my knight with their bishop, I'm not going to take back, but I'm going to take their queen on b6. Yes, I can take back my knight, but I want the queen for two pieces. My opponent is uses the queen to check on a5, and again, it seems to be a fork because both my king on e1 and my knight on a4 are attacked. But I knew it in advance, otherwise I would never have played it. There is only one move that saves both, and this is pawn goes to c3. My opponent sends the knight back to a7 because otherwise they are in for a surprise. Otherwise, my pawn goes to b4 and I have a fork. The computer says that this is a great move, and it is indeed a good move, but I don't think there is that much of a surprise to consider it as a great. Now I take the queen, that queen goes back to c7. And then I play a move that I was so proud when I played. I thought it was brilliant, but the computer says it is a blunder. Instead, I should have moved my pawn to b5. But let's see why did I play it. I didn't, of course, blunder my knight. I knew what was going to happen. And let's see what happened. I mean, at least I knew one of the possibilities, in fact, what actually took place. But before I continue, let me tell you that the computer thinks evaluation, which of course I didn't know during the game. I only did this just as I was preparing now this program. Computer gives evaluation of minus 1.93, meaning black has the advantage of almost 2 points. Yes, I take my knight as expected. I exchange bishops, and my queen goes to d4. That was my plan because now I attack two rooks, both the one directly on a7 and the pawn on g7, and after it falls, the rook at h8 is lost, and it's difficult for black to save both. Black tried to minimize the damage, but played the move that the computer thinks a blunder, and as a result, my from the evaluation from being a negative number minus 0.193 now it becomes a positive of plus 1.64. What they do is they move the pawn on b5, attacking my knight, and if I save my knight, I'll miss the opportunity to take the pawn on g7. What did the computer want? The computer want my opponent to place a knight at c6, attack my queen, and also protect the rook. Then I would take this rook here. I'm not sure how exactly they would continue like that. If it was possible to block my queen. Okay, that's a question that we may see it later perhaps. But I'm going to take the pawn and the rook. Peter thinks that my move was great to take the pawn on g7. It was too obvious. Personally, I think that for a move to be great, it should not be very obvious. It should come as a surprise. And I take my rook exactly as planned. My opponent saves the knight, the only way that was possible. Queen goes to d4 now. He's in the center. I don't want it to just waste there. Perhaps I could have taken the pawn on h7 to win a pawn. I didn't do it. Knight goes to c6, attacks my queen. Queen goes to c5 with a check. My opponent develops the knight and blocks the check, but also pins the knight. I castle alongside. Well, king is not that safe, but at least I have the open d file for my rook. And I do it a move early, otherwise I would first have to think where to place my bishop. Well, that's on f1. And now, my opponent has a miss. they try to destroy the pawn in front of my king. That's understandable. But they missed a chance to check from f4. And the only way I can save both pawns on e3 and f2 is place my queen on e3. Then we exchange queens, and I have a very bad pawn structure because my pawns at e3 and d4 will be double isolated pawns that are easy to get lost. That is why now my advantage becomes 1.24 because the computer was expecting that they would see this opportunity. And what I want to do, yes, I stop the check, but I want to fianchetto my bishop to give room for my bishop on f1. The computer thinks a blunder, and that is why the evaluation goes down to minus 0.76. Instead, they would like me to attack the knight. Once the knight leaves, we exchange queens, and my king is a little bit safer in the sense that there is less force against it. My opponent takes the pawn on b4. Great move is a computer, obvious move for me. I take back, and my opponent places his queen on b7. Computer thinks that was a mistake. Instead, they should have taken the pawn with the knight, because then my queen is pinned and I cannot take the queen or do anything. I have to exchange queens. My opponent has a very nice bishop at b4, threatening the pawn at a2, threatening lots of things. And that is now the evaluation from minus 176 goes up to 178. I defend my pawn on b4 to stop both. The pawn at a4 cannot continue, and also if my opponent tries to take the pawn, they'll have at least to sacrifice one of their pieces for these two pawns. King goes to g7. My pawn now goes to h4. Since I castled on the queen side, I try to attack on king side. Where is the opponent's king? And my opponent pushes the pawn to f5. Computer says it was a mistake. Instead, they should have pushed the pawn from e6 to e5. And as a result of this mistake, my advantage goes from 178 up to 268. But I missed my chance. I should have placed my rook on d6. Now my advantage goes down to 128. But black misses. They place their pawn on h5 instead of their queen on c7. And that is why my advantage goes up to 3.01. We continue. I try to safeguard my king, be out of the c file. I take the pawn. And my opponent places the knight at d4. And this, the computer thinks it's a mistake. Instead, they should have checked from d4. Let's see how it would look like. If they did, we would have to exchange queens. With a very strong knight on d4, the rook coming down, so on. I'm not sure how obvious is that. But the computer thinks now that my advantage goes all the way up to 4.96, almost a rook. And from now on, for many, many moves, the advantage is going to be between 4 and 5. We'll continue now, not too many spectacular moves after here. I'm checking with my pawn because it's going to be lost, but because I could save it if I took the pawn on e6, but then the queen has a very strong line. Since I'm going to lose the pawn, let's at least have the king go out. Continue now with the check, and I'm going to take back the pawn. Not only that, I eliminate pawns, both mine and my opponent's, in front of the enemy king. That's what you want, so the queen and the rook have more space to move. I check from h8. Now, what does my bishop do? It goes back to uh, b1, so my opponent's knight is pinned, and perhaps my bishop could be able to go to another diagonal, perhaps diagonal from a2, but let's see what happens. Queen goes to d5. Now I win a pawn and want to exchange. If you look at the material, by now I reached a +5 advantage after all the exchanges we had and the pawns that I was able to win. And clearly, with such an advantage, it's not surprising that the computer gives an evaluation between 4 and 5. My opponent doesn't want to exchange queens because if you have material advantage, you want to exchange material. Otherwise, you don't. Why? Let me explain. Because so long as there are queens in the board, there's always a chance that either I may blunder the queen or my opponent may find a combination that wins my queen, even if they have to sacrifice some material. Now, of course, there's a chance it may happen the other way around, but if I'm ahead by a rook, if I win an extra queen, doesn't matter too much. But if I'm extra rook and I lose the queen, that changes the result of the game. That's why usually I have to tell my viewers, if you're ahead, try to exchange material, and sometimes you may even have to sacrifice a pawn or two to do so. If you're behind, try to avoid exchanges. Opponent avoids exchange, queen goes to b3, and I have to be careful because I only have two legal moves. Rook, king goes either a1 or c1. If it goes to c1, rook goes to c8, and it is not going to be pretty because then other pieces can come and join the attack. Instead, my king goes to a1. I have to be careful. Either way or other, I was going to lose the pawn at a3. Now, because it's a bishop, I'm safe. If that was the rook, queen at a3 would be checkmate. Opponent will win the pawn, bishop protects. That's why I said if that had been a rook instead of a bishop, I would have lost immediately. And just to tell you, my previous defense, when I send my king to c1, here the computer thinks it is a great move. Here we are. And now, what does my opponent try to do? Try to win my queen. What would happen if I could easily take a bishop and a rook for my queen? Would that be good? I'm not so sure. My pawn will take the pawn here, and there would be an asymmetry. Then it might not be so easy for me to win. I would have two rooks and a bishop for a queen and a knight. I'm not sure how good would you have been. My advantage, I think, would be smaller. That is why I want to exchange. Put the queen out of danger. It goes to f4. I threaten now to exchange rooks, no matter what my opponent does. And yes, exchange the rooks. And we'll continue the game. I'm always plus between 4 and 5. I was hoping I could put my rook and also win the bishop at d7. Ain't going to happen, as I say. I want now to exchange queens. My opponent instead will take a pawn from me. The material advantage from +5 becomes +3. But still I have a very good position because of my two connected pass pawns, g3 and h4. If queens would disappear, they could give me the win. Plus I have an extra exchange. And now I'm going to win a pawn. Let's see how. Because I'm going to win pawn and bishop versus bishop, yes. And I'm in a very good position. I'm checking, but the good position is because if the queens disappear, the three connected pass pawns f2, g3, h4 would give me very, very good chances, while my king would be very near the a4 pawn to grab it. And if the knight tried to defend it, then my three pawns could move all the way until the end. My opponent does the only thing to save the knight because there was a double attack. Both the king and the knight were saved. And not only the knight blocks the check and saves itself, but the queen cannot check. c6, c8, g6, g8 are all covered by the knight. queen goes to e3. Why? I don't want my pawn to start checking the queen, and I don't want them to start pushing the pawn. I cannot grab it, but I can create issues. Yes, a pawn goes to a3. Of course, I cannot grab it, but what can I do? Now the problem is that my opponent is threatening checkmate on b2. So I need to cover the square at b2. If I keep my queen on e3, for example, pushed any of the pawns, my opponent's queen will go to b2, checkmate, game is over. And now I find the opportunity to exchange queen. My opponent has to exchange the queens because I'm threatening the queen with a check. And if they reply to check any other way, they lost a queen. So here we are. Well, it's not nice that my pawns are doubled, but I have a rook and 3 pawns versus knight, and the only pawn is too near my king. Double attack for my opponent attacks the 2 pawns, but one is defended by the rook, and the other would just go ahead and threaten the enemy's knight. Now this pawn is not easy to be saved, so I'm going to grab the other pawn in the meantime. No, first, let's push this one, the h, as much as possible. And now I grab the pawn on h3, actually on a3. And now I have a rook and 2 pawns versus the knight. Unfortunately, the pawns are not connected, but still, my advantage is between 4 and 5, as I mentioned. If I play correctly, I should win. My opponent threatens the pawn at h5. Well, my h pawn cannot move. Let me at least move my f pawn as much as possible. Moved again, threaten the knight. Now, king, since I already grabbed the pawn on the a file, it's going to come nearer to help and support the rook and the other 2 pawns. My h5 now is free to go to h6. By the way, the f pawn cannot be, I mean, would save it if I sacrifice the h pawn. I cannot protect both pawns. If I save the f pawn, its route is blocked by the knight. So instead, I'm going to push the h pawn, send it to h6, and sacrifice the f pawn. My opponent will not take it immediately. Otherwise, if you take it, my pawn goes to h7, and then either they sacrifice the knight and with rook and king versus king I win, or it goes to h8. They just block its way for now. And now, since the h pawn is blocked, I'm going to sacrifice it to save my f pawn. And I'm able to send my pawn to f7. And still I have a winning advantage. All I have to do is wait until either the king or the knight go away from the pawn. Of course, they not do it voluntarily by themselves, but if I force them, perhaps. King goes to g7. My king comes nearer. You may wonder why c5 and not d5, because d5, there is a check, and once you do the check, even that is a winning. Let me be careful. If you want to d5, if they checked, I take the knight, and if they take back, the king takes my rook, then the pawn promotes. But still I'm winning. But my opponent is going to block the pawn. It cannot go ahead. And from now on, all my opponent needs is to threaten the pawn with the knight. Before, if you try to do so, the pawn could promote with a check, but now the pawn cannot advance. Now I have to really be careful. And the computer says that my winning move should have been the king goes to d6. But unfortunately, that's not what I did. I pushed my rook to f5, trying to block. What I was thinking is to block any exit of the knight. It goes to f6, g5, it's lost. f8, it cannot go. So the king has to move. And I thought this would help me win, because the king would have to go either to e7 or g7. But the computer says that this was a big mistake. Now the advantage is between 0 and 1. Basically, the game is drawn. King goes to e7. All I have to do is wait for the knight to go anywhere and then pawn promotes, which is not going to happen. Computer, by the way, thinks that this is a great move. My king will try to approach, goes to c6. You see, that's why the enemy's king went to east, my opponent's, not my enemy, went to e7 instead of g7 because now my king cannot go too near. Knight goes to f8, another great move for my opponent because now the pawn is blocked. Even if the black kings moves far away, my pawn cannot go far away. Otherwise, really, the pawn could promote. Now let's see what happens later on. I see the decision is much more difficult. I'm afraid of losing my rook, so let's send it back to as far as possible. So at least I have my rook. And my opponent plays a move the computer thinks is great, meaning covering the promotion square by the knight. My king will try to go around the board to help the opponent possible. If my king could make it to g8, yes, then I could be winning. Of course, without a computer analysis, I had no idea that the game was drawn, although I was suspecting it, but let me try whatever I can do. My king tries to find a way around while avoiding any possible forks. It will try to go through f1 if it can. Now you see what's happened. The king covers the f8 pawn. So if the knight can go to a square to attack the pawn, then really we're talking about a draw because it's going to be rook against knight. Yes, exactly here is the situation. No way I can save this pawn. And then I have king and rook versus king and knight, which is a theoretical draw. And here we are. Now, let's see what is the situation. In theory, king and rook versus king and knight is a draw, but this assuming black plays the best game. What does white try to do when black wants to avoid? White has two ways of winning, if they either take the knight or the checkmate. How can you checkmate? King must be at the edge, the black king, the white king must be two uh, lines away, and the rook must be in such a position as to checkmate. The same way that you checkmate king and rook versus king. And the knight should be somewhere where it does not affect these checks. If it blocks the check, goes next to the king, then white has to do what's called a quiet move, and then the king has to go away from the knight, and then rook takes the knight. Another way is if the knight is lost. How can the knight be lost? If it is attacked and any square it goes is covered either by the rook or the king. If the knight is in the center, it has 8 squares to go, so all 8 of them must be covered. If it's at the edge, excuse me, if it's at the corner, only 2 squares. And perhaps it might be easier. For example, if the knight was at a1 and the king was at b2, the knight is lost. And assuming the black king is far away, not to save. These are the two ways. And under best play, black is not going to lose. It would be a draw, but will we have best play? Let's continue. Just to tell you, in case you wonder about the time control, I should have mentioned at the beginning, the time control is 3 moves, meaning every player has 3 moves to reply to their opponent's move, which means that if you take it seriously, they have so much time to do all the checks and the controls and analyze. They should not, of course, consult anybody else or a computer. but the possibilities are not that many. You can take pencil and paper and draw them and do the analysis if you have enough time. But usually, I have to tell you, most of us in these daily games, we are facing so many games representing our countries, our teams, in tournaments, that we don't have time to go through all that. That is why, in addition to all these mistakes and blunders you saw, there were too many inaccuracies, too many to go through them. But let me tell you, we're starting now the last phase of the game that theoretically it's a draw. But I'll try to see what can I do. At least I know that worst comes to worst, I cannot lose. There is no chance that black can defeat me. Because worst comes to worst, if they take my rook, then king and knight versus king is a draw. So let's see how did the game continue. Not going to analyze too much until the crucial moments. To tell you, both players try to do whatever. I'm trying to keep the king and the knight as near the edge of the board as possible. Attack the knight. Pin the knight, but the king will come next to that and save it. We're going back and forth. Now, black has to be careful because even if a move they play does not immediately lead to mate or loss of the knight, if they are not careful, it may lead to combination that will end up in one of these two scenarios, just to tell you, and not always easy to see it. But for now, black seems to be safe. King and knight for the blacks at the edge of the board, not a good idea, but and now the move that changes everything. According to the computer analysis, this is a draw and this is win for white. Of course, there was no way that black would have seen it. King should have gone to e8 instead of c8. But believe it or not, at this moment, the game ended for me, assuming, of course, I would continue successfully because it's not easy to see. And if I don't grasp the opportunity now that I have it, it may never come back. Let's see how did the game continue. I attack the knight on g7. Black is to save the knight. Knight goes to f4. Attack again the knight from f7. Knight goes to g6. Attack the knight from g7. You see, the knight is quite limited because the rook can block quite a lot of squares, and at least two of the escape squares, e7 and e5, are controlled by the white king. Knight goes to the edge, h4. Attack once again. Goes to f5. And now the king also attacks the knight. By that moment, the game should have been successful for me, but black should have thought what to do now. You see, the black knight doesn't have too many squares to go. It cannot go, of course, to g7. It cannot go to h4. Let me show them. Here, no. Cannot go to e7, no. Cannot go here to d6. Cannot go here to d4. Cannot go to h2, cannot go to g3. It has only two squares to go, either h6 or e3, excuse me. And just to tell you that both of them, according to the computer, are lost for black. But at least e3 would take longer, and I would need to use more of my energy to find the winning. It's not so clear from here. But my opponent sent the knight to h6, and then I immediately saw the winning move. My opponent threatens my rook, but my rook goes to g6. You're going to see here what happened is the black knight has nowhere to go. Count the squares one by one. Since at the edge of the board, it has only four squares to go. f7, f5, g4, and g8. Two are covered by the king, two are covered by the rook. And also the knight is threatened, so they cannot just move the king. And that's why my opponent at this point resigned. Move number 142. In case you wondered how long did it take since each player had 3 days per move, it started on August 15th and ended on August 30th, 15 days. Fortunately, we did not use all of our 3 days. Otherwise, the game could have gone for more than 2 years, believe it or not. And now let's give a look at the review. How did it go? I had a rating of 2000 versus 1950 of my opponent. You see, it was not that spectacular. Of course, both of them are much better than the 1300 you see here, but I've played the games with much higher ratings because I believe the computer many times is flattering. Let's see the accuracies, 88.7 versus 88.6, more or less the same. No brilliancy, great. My opponent had 7 versus 2. Best moves, 60 versus 56. So you see that out of the 141 moves, my opponent, 106, meaning more than 2/3, in fact, more than 3/4, 67, no, let me be careful. 67 out of 141 is almost less than a half. Almost less than a half of my opponent's move were the best possible. Especially if you had the two book moves, 69, you're very near the halfway mark. If you had the excellent moves, then my opponent's best, great, best, excellent, and book moves are 115 out of 141, meaning more than 80%. My numbers were a little bit lower. In the great, 7 versus 2, I'm down. In the best, I'm 60 versus 56. In the excellent, a little bit better, 54 versus 46. In the good, 12 versus 12. Book 4 versus 2. And in the negatives, I have 18 accuracies versus 6 of my opponent. Mistakes, my opponent 4, I had 2. Misses, my opponent had 2, I had 1. And blunders, I had 2 and my opponent had 1. But the only reason I shared this game with you, my friends, is because this was the longest game ever I had, with a surprising ending that I didn't expect. If you can recall which has been your longest game, what was the end, and if you have a link to that, please leave it in the comments. I'll be glad to see it. Hope you enjoyed it. And lesson, if you're ahead, even if it's a theoretical drawn position, don't settle for the draw. Go until the end. But if you're on the player that's behind, even if theory says a draw, be very, very careful until the end. Your opponent may be someone that may not settle for the draw and will try their best to defeat you. Once again, I'm Harry Lassoniziris. This is my YouTube channel, grecochess, and what do we have in store? My next videos are going to be about my participation in the New York State Championship in Albany, New York that took place last weekend. And then there are some more tournaments I'm participating. If all goes okay, this evening I'm starting a new tournament at the Queen's Chess Club in Floral Park. This Sunday I have the Chessanity tournament. If you haven't subscribed yet, please click this little button that says subscribe. If you have any comments, especially your longest games, are very much appreciated. Ladies and gentlemen, thanks for watching. Goodbye.